Imagine the Baltic coast at the break of dawn, September 1, 1939. The sky is pale gray, touched by the faintest streaks of light, while the sea breathes with a calm rhythm that suggests nothing unusual. Yet this morning is unlike any other in modern memory, for within minutes, the tranquility will be torn apart by cannon fire, and history itself will lurch violently forward. At the tip of the free city of Danzig, on a narrow peninsula called Westerplatte, a small Polish garrison of fewer than 200 men is stationed inside a modest depot of supplies and fortifications. They have been placed there for years as part of uneasy compromises between Poland and the German-dominated city, a living reminder of tensions simmering in Central Europe. Offshore lies the German battleship SMS Schleswig-Holstein. To the casual eye, it looks harmless, even antiquated, a relic of the First World War making a ceremonial visit to Danzig. German officials have assured the world that the ship is only on a goodwill tour. But in truth, its mission is sinister. Concealed within its steel hull are heavy guns manned by crews with orders to unleash devastation at a precise moment. That moment comes at 04:45 a.m. Without warning, the guns roar, belching fire toward the depot, and the first artillery shells of the Second World War smash into Polish soil. Windows shatter, earth trembles, and men are flung from their bunks by the force of the explosion. Historian Antony Beevor, in the Second World War, 2012, describes this as the instant when the world slid over the brink, the thunderclap signaling the greatest and bloodiest conflict in human history. One can almost see the shock in the faces of the young Polish soldiers, scrambling half-dressed for their rifles, hearts pounding as they realize the nightmare has begun. The sleepy dawn has become a furnace of steel, fire, and smoke. This was no exercise, no drill, but the beginning of something unimaginably vast.
The shock of those opening moments is almost cinematic. Picture the barracks rattling under repeated salvos, plaster dust raining from ceilings, and the acrid smell of burning fuel filling every corridor. Outside, flames leap skyward where shells strike storage depots, painting the morning horizon with orange light. The German battleship continues to fire methodically, each blast echoing across the bay like a giant hammer. In the chaos, Polish officers blow whistles and shout orders, rallying their men to defensive posts. Some soldiers clutch rifles in trembling hands. Others rush to machine gun nests, built discreetly within concrete bunkers. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, discipline holds. As historian Roger Morehouse explains in First to Fight, The Polish War, 1939-2019, these defenders were ordinary men, clerks, reservists, young recruits, yet they were determined to resist against overwhelming odds. Imagine one of them, a boy not long out of school, racing through smoke with ammunition boxes, his boots slipping on rubble, his breath tearing at his lungs, yet still driven by loyalty to comrades and country. Another soldier shouts through the din, waving his men toward a sandbagged position, while overhead, splinters of steel cut the air like shrieking demons. All around, Westerplatte convulses under fire. Yet, incredibly, instead of crumbling within minutes as the Germans had expected, the defenders dig in. The first counterbursts of Polish fire crackle back toward the attackers, rattling across the peninsula. Machine gun tracers rip into the dawn haze, forcing German Marines to take cover. The air grows thick with dust, smoke, and the piercing scent of cordite. This was the essence of the Polish spirit in September 1939 – defiance, even when logic said surrender. And as the first hour of the war unfolded, a haunting question lingered. Could this tiny garrison truly withstand the might of the rake? Or was Westerplatte already doomed to be nothing more than a fiery footnote to a war just beginning?
Smoke still hung over the peninsula like a dirty shroud when the German naval infantry prepared to storm Westerplatte. The plan seemed simple enough to Berlin's generals, overwhelm a depot defended by fewer than 200 men with a coordinated assault of more than 1,000 Marines supported by heavy artillery. Yet plans on paper rarely match the reality of battle. As the first waves of German troops advanced through the thin pine woods and sandy dunes leading toward the depot, they encountered a storm of machine gun fire that cut down dozens in seconds. Hidden within reinforced concrete guardhouses and cleverly camouflaged firing positions, the Polish defenders unleashed their weapons with remarkable accuracy. What the Germans had not anticipated was that these weaklings, as some Nazi officers dismissed them, had spent years quietly fortifying the depot with underground shelters, barbed wire, and overlapping arcs of fire. Historian Alexander Rossino in Hitler Strikes Poland, Blitzkrieg, Ideology and Atrocity, 2003, notes that Westerplatte's defenses were deceptively strong, giving the tiny garrison a chance to resist far beyond initial expectations. Imagine the scene. German Marines shouting, diving for cover among shattered trees, their boots sinking in sandy soil already stained red. The air vibrated with the staccato rhythm of automatic rifles, the thump of grenades, and the terrifying whistle of shells. The Poles, though vastly outnumbered, fought with an intensity born of desperation, each man knowing there was no retreat, no reinforcement waiting behind them. They were cut off, alone, facing one of the most powerful war machines in Europe. Yet in those early hours, it was the attackers who faltered, stumbling back under a hail of Polish fire. Smoke, screams, and confusion turned what should have been a swift victory into a bloody stalemate. The Germans realized with grim surprise that Westerplatte would not fall in a single morning.
By noon of the first day, the sun burned high above the Baltic, but its warmth could not pierce the chill of battle. The Germans regrouped, bringing up heavier weapons, including field artillery and Stuka dive bombers that howled down from the clouds like birds of prey. Explosions shook the depot as bombs cratered the ground, collapsing bunkers and filling trenches with fire. Yet when the dust settled, Polish resistance continued. From shattered guardhouses, rifles cracked defiantly. From hidden positions beneath the rubble, machine guns spat bullets into advancing ranks. Historian Richard Hargreaves in Blitzkrieg Unleashed, The German Invasion of Poland 1939, describes how astonishment spread among German officers who expected a quick triumph. Instead, they faced stubborn defenders who refused to yield, even as walls collapsed around them. Picture yourself in that moment, lying in a trench with dust in your mouth, ears ringing from the concussions, eyes stinging from smoke, and still gripping your rifle because the man next to you has already fallen. Courage was not abstract here. It was survival. It was instinct. It was the refusal to give ground even as the world disintegrated. German reports from that day admitted to heavy casualties, something embarrassing for a force that prided itself on invincibility. The men of Westerplatte, despite exhaustion and the gnawing realization that help would not come, managed to hold their lines. For Poland, this resistance became a spark of hope, proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, dignity could be preserved through defiance. And as darkness fell over the smoking ruins that evening, one thought echoed among the defenders. How long could they endure this storm? And would the outside world take notice of their lonely stand?
The second day at Westerplatte dawned with smoke still curling above the ruined guardhouses, a grim reminder that the small Polish garrison had survived what was meant to be their destruction. For the Germans, humiliation brewed. A depot defended by fewer than 200 men had repelled multiple assaults, leaving dozens of Marines dead on the sandy soil. Determined to erase this stain, commanders ordered fresh attacks at first light. German infantry crept through the shattered pines, supported by mortars and flamethrowers, their goal to burn the defenders out of their holes. Yet as soon as they crossed into the killing fields, the Polish machine guns opened fire once again. From camouflaged nests, tracers stitched the air, mowing down men and forcing the survivors to crawl for cover. Grenades burst among them, sending showers of dirt and screams into the morning haze. Historian Stephen Zaloga in Poland 1939, The Birth of Blitzkrieg 2002, explains that Westerplatte's defenders had been meticulously trained in overlapping fields of fire, meaning that every approach was covered by at least 2 machine guns. This tactical foresight allowed them to maximize their limited manpower, turning every advance into a gauntlet of death. Imagine the fury of those German soldiers, promised a swift victory, now lying flat in the sand, sweat stinging their eyes, bullets snapping overhead, and realizing that the weak depot was becoming a fortress of legend. Inside the Polish lines, exhaustion gnawed at the men, but adrenaline kept them moving. Ammunition was rationed carefully, orders barked in clipped tones, and even the wounded contributed by reloading weapons or passing supplies. The depot, though battered, had not yet yielded. The men of Westerplatte knew they could not win the war here, but they could write their defiance into history, one bullet at a time.
By the afternoon of that second day, the Germans shifted tactics. Frontal assaults had proven too costly, so they brought in additional artillery and air support to reduce Westerplatte piece by piece. Stuka dive bombers shrieked overhead, their sirens wailing like banshees as they dropped bombs that shattered bunkers and set the forest ablaze. Fire spread quickly among the pines, creating walls of flame that threatened to suffocate defenders in smoke and ash. Yet somehow, through choking air and raining debris, Polish rifles still cracked defiantly. Roger Morehouse, in First to Fight, The Polish War 1939, recounts how German commanders grew frustrated, astonished that such a small force could resist sustained bombardment. One can picture the defenders, blackened with soot, coughing blood into their sleeves, but still dragging themselves to firing positions. A sergeant might slap a comrade's shoulder, shouting encouragement through the roar, while another soldier, bandaged and bleeding, refuses to abandon his post. These men embodied a stubborn resilience that confounded the myth of German invincibility. Reports spread quickly. Radio broadcasts across Europe began to mention Westerplatte, calling it a symbol of Polish courage. For the attackers, every hour the depot remained unbroken was a blow to their prestige. For the defenders, each passing moment was proof that Poland's heart still beat. As dusk fell and the flames flickered against the night sky, both sides knew the fight was far from over. But deep inside the shattered depot, the Poles asked themselves a question they dared not voice aloud. How many more nights could they survive under this storm of steel and fire?
By the third day of the siege, Westerplatte was already a scarred landscape of twisted metal, cratered soil, and smoldering ruins. The Germans, furious at the delay, escalated their efforts. Heavy siege artillery was rolled closer, and their gunners began pounding the depot without pause, hoping to crush the defenders into silence. Imagine the peninsula, the sandy ground shaking like a drum with each impact, clouds of dust rising so thick that daylight dimmed, fragments of brick and concrete raining down like hail. Inside the bunkers, the Polish garrison pressed themselves against cold walls, teeth rattling with each detonation. Yet even amid the thunder, orders were calmly given, weapons checked, and spirits held together by sheer determination. Historian Richard Hargreaves in Blitzkrieg Unleashed, the German invasion of Poland 1939, notes that despite catastrophic bombardment, the defenders managed to maintain discipline, emerging from their shelters the moment shelling paused to repel infantry probes. Every lull in fire was followed by a sudden Polish volley, catching attackers off guard. Picture the Germans charging through the smoke, believing the defenders finally dead, only to be cut down by rifle fire that erupted from ruined buildings. In those moments, the myth of quick victory dissolved further. Each attack cost lives, each step forward was paid in blood, and every German Marine realized they were locked in a battle far harder than promised. Still, German commanders believed weight of fire would eventually triumph.
Stuka squadrons returned again, screaming from the sky, bombs exploding with concussions that split eardrums. Forests around Westerplatte burned fiercely, the crackle of flames mingling with distant artillery. For the Poles, it was a vision of hell, fire on the ground, iron from the sky, and death always a heartbeat away. Yet they endured, clinging to hope that their resistance was not in vain.
Within the Polish lines, conditions grew increasingly dire. Ammunition stocks dwindled, food supplies thinned, and water had to be rationed carefully among the wounded and exhausted men. The barracks, once a place of order, now resembled a field hospital filled with groans of the injured, bloody bandages, and the acrid smell of antiseptic mixed with smoke. Despite all this, morale did not collapse. Historian Norman Davies, in God's Playground, The History of Poland, 2005, emphasizes that the defenders of Westerplatte fought with the knowledge that their sacrifice would echo beyond their own survival, inspiring resistance across their homeland. Imagine a young soldier sitting in the dim bunker light, sharing his last piece of bread with a comrade, whispering that Poland must never bow to tyranny. Around him, others clean rifles by candlelight, whispering prayers, or writing quick notes on scraps of paper in case they never see their families again. Outside, the Germans continued their relentless pressure, cutting off any possibility of reinforcement. Radio operators inside the depot managed to send a few desperate signals, but no relief could come. The Polish army was already stretched thin, facing invasion on multiple fronts. The garrison knew they were alone, yet even in solitude, they found strength in unity. Each day survived was a message broadcast to the world. Poland resists. Each casualty borne with dignity was a statement louder than propaganda. When the night of the third day fell, the depot lay half in ruins, the forest charred, the air thick with smoke and ash. Still, from within the shattered walls, rifle fire cracked into the darkness, a stubborn heartbeat refusing to fade. And so the question hung heavier with each passing hour. How long could mere men endure under such crushing firepower before the inevitable end arrived?
By the fourth day of the siege, Westerplatte had ceased to be merely a local battlefield. It was becoming a symbol broadcast across Europe and beyond. Radio reports carried the astonishing news that a tiny Polish garrison, numbering fewer than 200 men, was still holding out against the full fury of the German war machine. Newspapers in London, Paris, and New York began to mention the name Westerplatte with tones of awe and respect. Imagine civilians reading the morning papers, coffee cups trembling in their hands as they realized that the Second World War had truly begun, and in its opening chapter, a handful of Poles were defying Hitler's army. Historian Anita Prajmowska in Poland, A Modern History, 2010, explains that while governments debated strategy, ordinary people found inspiration in the idea that courage could slow the juggernaut of aggression, if only for a moment. For Germany, however, the failure to crush Westerplatte quickly was embarrassing. Propaganda had promised a swift, overwhelming victory, the demonstration of Blitzkrieg's invincibility. Instead, the world watched as day after day passed, and the defenders refused to surrender. Inside the Reich's military circles, frustration simmered. Officers pressed harder, demanding renewed assaults, heavier bombardments, and psychological warfare to break the garrison's spirit. Loudspeakers blared surrender demands across the smoking no-man's land, promising mercy if the Poles laid down arms. But the defenders answered only with silence and occasional bursts of gunfire. In that silence, the world heard something more powerful than speeches: defiance. The men of Westerplatte were writing a message in smoke and blood, one that echoed across borders. They might not change the outcome of the campaign, but they had already changed the story of its beginning.
Conditions inside the depot grew harsher with every hour, yet the determination of the defenders hardened rather than cracked. Food rations had shrunk to crumbs, water was measured by drops, and the wounded lay in makeshift cots, tended by comrades who lacked proper supplies. Still, discipline endured. Guards rotated at their posts, officers kept watchful eyes, and morale was sustained by the knowledge that the world was now listening. Historian Timothy Snyder in Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, 2010, highlights how moments like Westerplatte became touchstones of memory, illustrating that even under totalitarian assault, human dignity could shine. Picture a bunker lit by a single lantern. Soldiers huddled together, coughing from smoke inhalation, some bleeding, all exhausted, yet still exchanging jokes to lighten the mood. One man scribbles a quick farewell to his wife, folding the note into his pocket, knowing it may never reach her, but unwilling to die without words of love. Another polishes his bayonet, muttering that if the Germans come through the door, they will pay dearly for every step. The unity of these men, forged in fire, transcended fear. Outside, the Germans attempted psychological tactics, broadcasting threats and promises through megaphones, but the Poles answered only with more gunfire. The silence between shots was filled with resolve. Across Europe, listeners wondered, if a small depot could resist for so long, what might entire nations accomplish if they too stood firm? The world's attention sharpened, alliances stirred, and debates grew heated in distant capitals. Yet for the men at Westerplatte, none of this mattered. Their world was the burning peninsula, the collapsing bunkers, and the comrades beside them. Still, the deeper question lingered. Could inspiration alone sustain flesh and blood against bombs and bullets, or was the end drawing inevitably closer?
By the 5th and 6th days of the siege, the physical strain on Westerplatte's defenders became almost unbearable. The once sturdy guardhouses were reduced to rubble, their walls gaping open like broken teeth. Fires smoldered everywhere, sending choking smoke into bunkers where men tried desperately to rest between bombardments. Sleep was scarce, food nearly gone, and the wounded groaned in agony without hope of proper treatment. Yet still the defenders resisted. German forces escalated again, dragging up 210mm howitzers and additional heavy mortars to pound the depot into dust. Each salvo tore deeper into the earth, collapsing dugouts and spraying concrete fragments like shrapnel. Historian Alexander Rosino, in Hitler Strikes Poland, 2003, describes these days as a grinding war of attrition, with the Germans determined to annihilate the garrison through sheer weight of fire. Imagine being one of those defenders, crouched in a bunker lit only by flickering candlelight, ears ringing from endless concussions, throat dry as sandpaper, stomach gnawed by hunger, and still clutching your rifle because you know the assault will come again. Outside, Stukas dove repeatedly, their sirens screaming terror into the air before bombs shook the ground like earthquakes. Entire sections of the depot vanished into craters. Trees were splintered to black stumps. The forest transformed into a wasteland. German infantry advanced cautiously behind these barrages, but each time they approached, Polish fire greeted them. Even weakened, the garrison held its lines. Their determination was astonishing, though cracks began to show. Ammunition stocks dwindled to the last magazines, medical supplies were exhausted, and morale, though outwardly strong, carried the weight of despair. Yet even in this twilight, their defiance glowed fiercely. The men of Westerplatte knew they were living on borrowed time, but they resolved to make every hour of resistance count, each one a wound inflicted on German pride.
Inside the battered depot, conversations grew darker. Officers met in hushed councils, debating how long the garrison could survive without resupply. Colonel Heinrich Sucharski, the commander,
was torn between duty and the responsibility to preserve the lives of his men. Historian Roger Morehouse, in First to Fight, The Polish War 1939-2019, notes that Sucharski wrestled with exhaustion and even illness during these days. Yet his officers urged him to continue, arguing that surrender would dishonor the sacrifice already made. Picture the scene: a dimly lit command post, maps scattered across a damaged table, candles flickering as dust sifts down from trembling ceilings. Sucharski leans heavily on his chair, face pale, eyes shadowed, while younger officers press him with arguments to fight on. Their voices rise, then soften, each man aware that their decisions could seal the fate of comrades outside. Meanwhile, in the trenches, ordinary soldiers whispered about home, wondering if their families knew they still lived, if their struggle had reached the ears of the nation. Some men cried silently in the dark, not from fear alone, but from the crushing weight of exhaustion. Yet when dawn broke, they returned to their positions, rifles ready, jaws set. Courage became less about heroism and more about persistence, the refusal to collapse. German megaphones blasted once more, promising safety if the Poles laid down arms. No answer came. Instead, bursts of machine gun fire rattled defiantly. Across the no-man's land, German commanders grew angrier, their pride wounded with every day the garrison endured. For the defenders, survival itself was victory, a living message that Poland did not kneel. But beneath their stubborn resolve, the question gnawed at every mind: could human flesh withstand endless iron and fire? Or would the breaking point finally come with the next bombardment?
By the seventh day of the siege, Westerplatte was no longer simply a battlefield. It was a graveyard of shattered bunkers, blackened trees, and exhausted men. The Polish defenders had endured almost a full week under ceaseless bombardment, without relief, without resupply, and without hope of escape. Their uniforms were filthy with soot and blood, their bodies weakened by hunger and thirst, their nerves frayed by the endless drumbeat of shells. Yet, remarkably, they still clung to their posts. Each sunrise brought new German attacks, mortars thumping, artillery thunder rolling, dive bombers screaming from the sky. Historian Richard Hargreaves in Blitzkrieg Unleashed, The German Invasion of Poland's 1939-2010, describes how the peninsula was systematically reduced to rubble, with virtually no structure left standing. Still, the defenders refused to collapse. Picture the scene on that seventh morning: soldiers crawling through rubble to shift wounded comrades deeper into makeshift shelters, men with bandaged heads or arms propping rifles against shattered walls, and commanders moving from position to position with words of encouragement, even as their own voices cracked with exhaustion. The air reeked of smoke and death, yet defiance still lived. At times, silence fell across the battlefield, broken only by the moan of wind through burnt trees. Then the bombardment resumed, shaking earth and sky, as if the Germans sought to hammer not just stone, but human spirit into dust. And still, the Poles answered with scattered bursts of gunfire, a stubborn signal that Westerplatte had not yet fallen. This resilience amazed even their enemies. German soldiers, hardened by training and indoctrination, began to murmur with reluctant respect for the defenders who seemed to rise from the ruins again and again. But admiration could not stay the hand of war. The order remained: Westerplatte must be crushed.
Inside the depot, however, the breaking point was approaching. Ammunition stocks were down to a handful of magazines, grenades nearly exhausted, heavy weapons mostly destroyed. The wounded filled every corner of the bunkers, some barely clinging to life, others already gone, their bodies wrapped in blankets for lack of coffins. Food had run out almost entirely. Water was drawn sparingly, every sip weighed against the need to keep fighting. Colonel Henryk Sucharski, tormented by fever and despair,
finally admitted that the garrison could not hold indefinitely. Historian Norman Davies, in Rising 44, The Battle for Warsaw, 2003, emphasizes that Sucharski's decision to contemplate surrender was not weakness, but a recognition of humanity. His men had done more than anyone expected, and further sacrifice would mean annihilation without purpose. Imagine the moment when the decision crystallized. Officers gathered in the dim light of a bunker, their faces hollow, eyes ringed with shadows, the distant thud of German guns shaking dust from the ceiling. Voices rose in debate, some arguing to fight to the last, others urging surrender to preserve what remained. At last, Sucharski spoke, his voice hoarse but firm. They had held long enough to inspire Poland and to shame Germany. To die now would be meaningless. Outside, soldiers prepared for yet another day of battle, unaware that the order to surrender was close. Some clutched rifles with trembling hands, whispering prayers, while others sharpened bayonets, determined to sell their lives dearly. In that moment, courage took on a new shape, not reckless defiance, but the acceptance that survival could also be honorable. As the night of the seventh day fell, the defenders of Westerplatte faced the hardest truth of war. Even legends must end, and dawn would bring the final chapter of their stand.
On the morning of September 7, 1939, after 7 harrowing days of resistance, the Polish garrison at Westerplatte finally prepared to surrender. The order had been given by Colonel Henryk Sucharski, whose body was racked with fever and whose spirit bore the weight of impossible choices. The defenders had fought until their ammunition was nearly gone, their bunkers shattered, and their wounded too numerous to count. They had endured bombardments from land, sea, and air, survived fires that turned the pine forest into a blackened wasteland, and stood against repeated infantry assaults. Now, with nothing left to give, they would lay down their arms not in shame, but in solemn dignity. Historian Roger Morehouse, in First to Fight, The Polish War 1939, 2019, describes how Sucharski, accompanied by a small group of officers, walked slowly out from the ruins beneath a white flag. Imagine the silence of that moment, guns finally quiet after days of thunder, smoke drifting lazily in the air, German soldiers watching with a mixture of relief and grudging respect. The Polish officers' uniforms were tattered, boots scuffed, faces blackened with soot and exhaustion. Yet they walked upright, heads high, embodying the resilience of men who had defied the odds. German commanders, astonished by the garrison's endurance, are said to have saluted their opponents. Accounts suggest that General Eberhard even allowed Sucharski to retain his ceremonial sword, a gesture of honor toward warriors who had fought beyond all expectation. For the men of Westerplatte, surrender meant survival. They had already achieved what no one thought possible. They had delayed the German timetable, drawn the attention of the world, and inscribed their courage into the opening chapter of the Second World War. The guns fell silent, but the echoes of their defiance would reverberate far beyond that small peninsula.
The legacy of Westerplatte endures not because it changed the outcome of the September campaign. Poland was overwhelmed in weeks by the combined might of Germany and later the Soviet Union, but because it demonstrated the power of resistance against impossible odds. Outnumbered 20-1, bombarded relentlessly and cut off from all support, fewer than 200 Polish soldiers held out for 7 days against one of the most formidable militaries in history. Historian Antony Beevor, in the Second World War 2012, argues that Westerplatte became a symbol of defiance, a story retold across Europe to remind people that tyranny could be resisted, however briefly. For Poles, it became a rallying cry during the dark years of occupation, proof that their nation's spirit could not be extinguished. Imagine generations later, visitors standing on that same peninsula, now marked by monuments and memorials, the ruins preserved as silent witnesses. The wind rustles through pine trees that have grown back over scorched earth, and one can almost hear the echoes of gunfire, the shouts of defenders, the pounding of artillery. School children learn the names of those who stood at Westerplatte, while soldiers across the world study the defense as an example of courage under siege. In modern Poland, Westerplatte is more than geography. It is shorthand for sacrifice, endurance, and national pride. And beyond Poland, the story resonates universally. It raises questions about what ordinary people can endure, how long defiance can last when defeat is inevitable, and why such acts matter even when they cannot alter outcomes. As the war raged on, Westerplatte remained a memory, a reminder that sometimes the smallest stands shine the brightest. For us today, the lesson is clear. Courage is not measured only by victory, but also by the refusal to bow in the face of overwhelming force. Would we, placed in such dire circumstances, find the strength to hold for 7 days? That question lingers, an echo across time. And if this story has moved you, consider subscribing to this channel, where more forgotten battles and untold histories are brought to life, so together we keep memory alive.